Yes, also from me, a very warm welcome on this last talk of the enterprise track. So I really like to share some insights I gained over the last years while working with my company and using native and cross-platform apps in the enterprise context. My goal kind of is to maybe give you some guidelines and mention some pitfalls we discovered over the years while working in both environments, so that whenever you're in the position to make such a big technology decision, if you go for a cross-platform app or you stay with like two native apps, so that you maybe are able to make a better decision here. Before I get started, why I think I can give you some insights here. Before I started the company Luvago here in Berlin about 6.5 years ago, I also worked at SAP and built a lot of enterprise mobile solutions for them, mostly in like prototyping stage. And after that, I continued to do the same thing with my company. So what we do mostly, we enable enterprise customers, in some random cases also startups, which don't really have a lot of expertise in state-of-the-art mobile technology, cloud technology, or web technology, to build digital products really fast. And then usually we do a couple of iterations on their initial MVPs with them. And after that, we build up teams inside those companies so that they can handle the products and the technology going forward on their own. And whenever we do such a project, we really start quite early, so we are involved in the design phase already, so we are not an engineering-only company. We also have a lot of UX designers on board. This particular question, hey, should we go for a cross-platform app or two native apps, comes up in almost all the projects. And it's almost, in the past, have been quite tricky to answer. And I think over the last couple of years, there have been definitely a trend to, also in the enterprise context, use cross-platform applications. And this is, again, what I want to talk about today. Since this is the enterprise track, I don't want to focus so much on the tech aspect of things. So I really want to take a bit of different perspective here. I really want to first highlight also how do you set up teams? What is important of creating either like transforming existing teams or hiring new people for cross-platform developments. Then I will take a look at the product side, which involves the tech side, of course, a little bit. And in the end, I want to give a little bit outlook on the economic side, just to give you an idea. Because again, people think mostly when you use cross-platform apps, at least in the enterprise context, and they don't have a lot of expertise in these technologies, that you can basically save half the time while choosing a cross-platform framework. I think in the tricky part also about this question when you deliver new products is you do that fairly early on in the process, so you maybe don't know all the final requirements, you're still in the requirement phase, and it's quite expensive and hard to reverse that initial decision in the end. So this is why it's quite important to get that right, and yes, that's what I want to share with you. Just to put in a little bit of scope, what I want to focus on today, I don't want to talk about anything regarding the web. I think we heard that in the earlier talks, also in the keynote this morning. I really want to focus on the part cross-platform or native development, and I can share some insights from projects we did with React Native, which I have in general, quite positive experience. And we also did some projects on Xamarin technology, where I have, let's say, a more mixed experience with the results in the end. So that's just the scope I want to share today. Let's get started with the team. So as I said, usually we go into companies early when they don't have a team yet, and then we either help them to transform the team they already have, get their existing developers, engineers on new technologies, or we help them also to recruit people and set up completely new teams. And this is, I think there's nothing new when we just look at how the different technologies are really, or the different frameworks are really used and what technologies they are based upon. We look at, let's say, a very wide range of technologies. So every native framework platform has its own programming language. We have own package managers, so own processes, own tools. So the first thing I even experienced in enterprise projects is that they just tried, okay, we have mobile developers here, why not just use them on a totally different technology, which doesn't work. So we usually follow two paths. Either we're gonna try to switch people over, and I try to summarize our learnings here, just using some t-shirt sizes in terms of, if I have a set of developers, how much effort and time is it to basically train them and make them productive in another technology. So when we start with Android, and first have a look at the whole React Native part. So I think developers, at least in my experience, it is like a medium-sized effort. So you're usually looking at a couple of months of time they need until they are fully productive in the new environment when they switch from pure native Android development to React Native, especially considering that if you also change the programming model, for example, we tend to use, we bring in some web technology, Redux, reactive programming also into the mobile world using React Native, and then with the change of a programming model, developers need usually a bit more time to adjust. I think the same is true for iOS, so I wouldn't see any big differences here when you say, okay, I have a team of Android and iOS developers in order to migrate them to the React Native platform. What worked really good for us, and also I'm happy maybe to hear some other experiences and feedback of your experiences about that, is to really take JavaScript developers, also full stack JavaScript developers, and bring them onto the mobile team. And because they're used to the tool set already, they're used to the processes, and if you use again reactive programming and Redux on both sides, I think you can have a really good advantage and onboard them quite fast. The thing I wouldn't recommend at all, I had that in one experience when we really had a company that was focused on .NET development, and they tried out React Native. That turned out to be a quite difficult transition phase because they don't have any mobile experience, the tools are different, the language is different, and basically everything is different. So that's kind of the learning on the React Native side. It's a bit different for Xamarin. I don't know if you have any experience with that. This is actually quite popular in enterprise companies that have a very wide or very developed .NET stack already there, because they can reuse existing processes, technologies, developers. So here we experience a quite also streamlined onboarding process when we switch from, let's say, .NET development to Xamarin development. On the other hand, of course, it's the other way around when you try to have a JavaScript developer onboarded to a Xamarin team. This is quite challenging. And I think iOS, it's a bit more difficult than Android because the platform tools and language are not as similar. So these are rough ideas for the learning. I would recommend to basically skip the large parts, the red ones, but if you have to, from a corporate perspective, onboard a new team, I think this could maybe give you some indication of how fast or how long it takes. The second part, of course, it's recruiting, and here it's a learning I had across different companies, different team sizes, at least in Germany, and especially if you move away from the larger cities. So if you are corporate in rural areas of Germany, you usually have a harder time just hiring expert developers, experienced engineers for cross-platform technologies. This, I think, has a couple of reasons. The only thing, as I think the message behind that is that, again, the decision for a framework is not only a tech decision, but it's also driven by, for example, the HR or recruiting department. So try to reach out to them, try to identify, hey, can we recruit enough experienced staff in time for that new platform, and also in budget, of course. So here, if you bring them in early in the project, I think you can have prevent to have delays in the recruiting process and thereby delays in the product, which I actually experience quite often. Which actually brings me to the next question, and this is experience. I just put a simple timeline out here about the first public SDK releases, so when really the developer community began to grow. And you can see that iOS started in 2008, then we had Android a year later on. The first, I would say, cross-platform summary release came in 2013 with their 2.0 release, and React Native is really public since only 3 years. So again, enterprise companies tend to hire for lead positions people with a lot of experience in their field, and this is often a position they struggle with. So if you have that kind of policy in the company, again, that even makes the recruiting process harder upfront to set up the team according to the experience. Of course, things shift, technologies develop all the time. But yeah, there's definitely something to consider as well if you want to hire a team consisting of a lot of senior people. And then, lastly, on the people section, I think it's also a really important point is the technical culture here. So. In enterprise environments, I think we heard that before in the talks, things move much slower than in startups and environments. So when using cross-platform technologies in startups, I didn't have any issues with that. But if enterprise companies, they usually think in release cycles of 6 months or 12 months even. And here usually the, let's say, native cycle fits a bit better in the culture, because if you use a new framework that isn't very mature, for example, React Native, you have a lot of major releases, you have a lot of code that breaks, a lot of refactoring you need to do just for the underlying framework. And in terms of like management understanding for these refactorings in enterprise companies, my experience is that this can be quite hard and challenging. So before I do the final decision on that, also make sure that the enterprise company has the right culture. Again, in startups, it's a whole different story. Yes, that's about the team. Maybe as a quick summary, I think really make sure to talk to all the people involved if you want to transfer a team over. Make sure the developers are interested in the technology, or that you can hire and recruit the right talent in the right time. So this is like the key learning, and as well that the whole technology culture fits around that as well. Let's move on to product. So here, again, we are involved fairly early in the process, so we usually do some technical consulting early on before starting off the development process, and this is where we make that decision. And no matter what you do, I think this is also common sense, like cross-platform apps are going to be always more complex than native apps. Why do I mention that explicitly? We got a lot of requests lately from people trying to say, hey, we just need an app for one platform, for Android, for example, but we want to build it in React Native. Where I say, hey, this is something I would discourage from doing, because you add complexity that you don't need, that you don't benefit from, and that will definitely cause some trouble down the road. The next point is a kind of checklist. What are apps or types of products I never would build on top of cross-platform technology? In the enterprise context, again, right? So we have augmented reality apps, we have virtual reality apps. I would say everything that involving complex animation. I think we already heard a couple of examples before. And everything that has platform-specific APIs, where you say, okay, the APIs on iOS is much different from the API on Android, so you would need to spend a lot of time in like writing integration layers and so on. So these are definitely examples I would say from the beginning. These exclude cross-platform apps. And then we have things like watch integrations, TV integrations. I know there have been support added in this areas as well, but I would still say at this point in time I would not use cross-platforms in these use cases. Also, when you do OS widgets, which appear on the start screen maybe of your phone, and this is also something I would always say to take to the native environment easier. And another thing, again, and this is specific for like larger enterprise companies which have maybe legacy EDM solutions. For example, there are very popular still in big companies also in Germany, like BlackBerry EDM solutions, and they have quite complex integrations in terms of security and authentication. And whenever you deal with such use cases, I would also recommend to use native applications, because you're going to have a lot of problems on this level already with those legacy systems and not. Then I mentioned 2 points, which is maps and GPS tracking. So I think these are ones that are not naturally KO criteria for the cross-platform apps, but here I would build prototypes really before making a final decision. So if your product heavily relies on maps, and I mean not just putting a couple of pins on that, but maybe doing complex overlays and calculation, I would always build a prototype first, evaluate if the technology can satisfy your UX user requirements. On the same page, I'm with the GPS tracking. Again, simple tracking scenarios are no problem, but if you, for example, have more complex scenarios, there are libraries available that basically bridge that gap, but I would always recommend to really build a short prototype, test it, and make sure it works before building your whole app on this cross-platform technology. The next point I want to mention is DevOps. So we usually build most of our build pipelines on Fastlane because this really helps to automate, improve developer collaboration, the whole build and shipment process. But here the experience is unfortunately that, especially if you're in the early stages of a product and you change a lot of things and you really want to move fast, that means you change a lot of third-party libraries, and this means that those automated build pipelines need to be adopted quite often, and this is always a big overhead. So if you have a large team, and this large team is basically you have your own DevOps team, then make sure that you have enough resources available there to really promote this process, to really fix things in time. And if you don't have an own DevOps project, make sure that you put in enough time and budget on the developer side to deal with those issues that don't really add value to the product, but rather about fixing DevOps infrastructure issues. The next point is also only, of course, applies to enterprise organizations. So I know a lot of customers who, from us, who have really restricted open source processes and policies. So when you want to use an open source policy, you need to enter them in a system, and you get you need to get legal to approve on that, and you have to do that for each release again and again and again. And of course, also a lot of native apps use open source technology, but in those organizations, they already have established processes for those native technologies. And in new or fairly new cross-platform technologies, this is missing. So I had experience in the past that we spent a good part of the project actually not doing any benefit, but rather dealing with the enterprise processes around open source certification, which can be quite annoying and of course slow down the project as well. And then the next, I think, thing which is quite important is when we talk about third-party SDKs. So a lot of apps we build, for example, use data from CRM, ERP applications, and if those SDKs have SDKs, these systems have SDKs, they are usually at the very core of the application. This is fine when you have these kind of bindings. Some frameworks call it bridges. So basically, you have to have some code connecting your generic cross-platform code to the native SDKs. So if the SDK vendor ships this already, you're fine. If he doesn't ship that, then, of course, from a technology point of view, there's no problem. You can build those bridges on yourself. But usually, this comes at such a big cost in terms of overhead and development time that I would say if you have to build those red boxes, these red bindings yourself, I would rather discourage you from using cross-platform applications, because this will burn most of the benefits. The last lesson from that is why you really analyze the shared third-party SDKs, I would really try them out. So we had a lot of experiences with, you look at the marketing material or you look at the documentation, and they had bindings, but in practice they have a lot of issues, they were outdated. So again, if your app relies heavily on third-party SDK integrations, also give that a try up front before you make your final decision. Otherwise, you're gonna have much trouble down the road. To conclude with the product section, what is my overall recommendation here? I know there are very different types of architectures, frameworks you can use, but my general high-level approach would be take a look at your cross-platform code and then take a look at your product and identify which parts of the product really need to be OS specific. So which part do you need to build for both platforms at the same time, essentially? And if the answer is more than a couple of exceptions, I would, again, discourage you from using a cross-platform app, because in the end, this is you're going to spend more time in generating these layers and abstraction layers and maintaining them over time than you would save in any like time savings while only using this cross-platform code base. So, of course, you will always have things like notifications that are platform-specific or how you enable GPS tracking. So these are all small parts. But again, if one of the core features of your product evolves in an OS-specific part, I would simply go with a native approach. Okay, that concludes the product section. And the last point is, again, let's take a look at the profits and see on that from an economical perspective. So I think the common misconception is, and we get that, our sales team gets this fairly early in the process. So they say, hey, we have an idea, so we like interact a little bit with the customer, try to get a high-level understanding of the requirements, and afterwards give them a rough estimation in terms of time, effort, and budget you would need for a particular project. And then, of course, this decision again comes up, and then he says, well, UX is not so important usually, let's just use a cross-platform technology and then we like save half the costs. And this is simply not true. Now I will like present you a simple model that maybe helps you to get a rough estimation of how much you can actually solve depending on how your build process looks like or your development process. So this is a pretty simple model of a development process. Again, different companies handle that in different ways. Let's say this is one sprint, you do development, and after this is done, you have some testing phase. Testing can mean we have customers where the developers do the testing, and we have customers where like product management is usually driving testing efforts, and then we have customers who have own Q&A teams, right? And depending on that, you can get an understanding how much effort you spend there, and then of course you have always the rollout phase, which also can be quite annoying if it's not automated. You have to generate screenshots in different languages. You have to publish it to either the app stores or your internal EDM network infrastructure and roll it out. So, and what you can see already, the only part from that process you really save time or could save time is the development phase, because you need to do the rest anyway. Now the question is how much time, from my experience in our projects, we can save. And I would say, if I have to give a rough number, it's about 25%. So it's far away from 50%. Why is that? When we develop a cross-platform app, our developers basically have, they have an iPhone and an Android device all the time attached to their computers, and each commit they do, or before they do each commit, they really run the application, even the smallest feature, on all devices, right? So you don't save any time there. There are so many pitfalls, issues that come up in those integration layers that you cannot build it on one platform and try to ship it. So before each merge, each development step, they will run it on both platforms. In addition to that, as I said, even simpler features like notifications or how do you enable GPS? How do you configure certain permissions? Or how do you handle in-app purchases? These are all things you need to do twice, no matter what framework you use on top. And this is also something that will reduce the time. You might end up with something like 35% if you have a very simple application, or if you have a more complex application, it can down to 10%. But like as a rule of thumb, that is what I come up with. Now, going back to the overall process, let's assume we have like 70% of the resources are really spent on development, and then we have a testing process which needs 25% of the resources, and we spend 5% of the time on rollout. You can see that these savings are actually narrowed down to even 70.5%. Again, please don't take this number as an absolute number. Just have a look at your processes, how you spend time, how your team is set up, how big your testing team is, and based on that, I think you can get a rough number and then make a economic decision if, in the end, the framework makes sense or not. Then we also heard that before in the talk before. Economics is also a question of risk, and the biggest risk, of course, is the vendor login. So once you decided to build your app with a framework technology, with a cross-platform technology, you're having a quite hard time to switch back from that. I know there are coming up approaches where you have like hybrid, also with React Native hybrid approaches. You have part is native, part is React Native. But in general, if your vendor decides he doesn't want to continue the framework anymore and there's no community driving it, you basically are back to square one. You have to like rebuild the app from scratch. And of course, this is a risk. I think I've seen startup companies taking that risk fairly easy, but in like the decision processes again of larger enterprise organization, this can be also a killer for the whole cross-platform project, right? So I've seen people that say, no, this is too risky. We really move back to native. At the same time, there's something about switching costs. So I heard people say, hey, we have these two native apps, and we don't want to really maintain both at the same time anymore. Can you guys help us to switch to a cross-platform framework? And then, when you get into talks, usually those projects die because there's really no business case for that. Only if you want to have really large iterations on the product, if you do a lot of new features, improvements, or large refactorings, then this could be an option. But if you have a relatively stable product, I really haven't seen an economic use case yet for switching that over to a native or to a cross-platform frameworks. But there are more upsides, and this is especially true, the first one, so that you don't have to hire people for two different platforms, because if you look at smaller projects, right? For example, if you have a project that one full-time developer can easily build, it's usually easier to have, in my personal experience, to have like one developer on that instead of having two developers on that, because of course then you have to onboard, meet, and organize two developers instead of one. So in small projects, I think this can get you an upside. Then, and of course, this can also be discussed later in terms of how realistic is it to reuse some of the code you do for your cross-platform apps in web applications later and the other way around. I think there are some pretty interesting developments going on. I never have seen that in the enterprise context that have been used in production before, but maybe in the future this is a pretty interesting process. At the same time, when your organization requires you to do code certification processes. So basically, before you're allowed to ship a release, they have a lot of tools and analysis of the code to make sure they comply with security guidelines, internal guidelines, and again, open source guidelines. Then you can also streamline this process because you only have one code base and one technology you need to review, which can give you some advantage here. To summarize this, so I think cross-platform frameworks in the enterprise context allow you really to build great applications with a single technology, and you can save up to maybe about 20% of the costs if all the things I mentioned before are met. So that means you need to ensure your organization has the right culture in order to adapt these new technologies, and you have the organization has to be able to recruit this suitable people in time. I would always look from a product perspective at things and say, only do it if a product really has very little platform-specific code, And finally, if you want to get a very detailed picture of how your profits and saving looks like, really take a deep analysis of your existing processes, a full-fledged review of your requirements you're looking at, and then you get a pretty good understanding of what the budget looks like. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you very much. I would be interested to hear your feedback or your experiences now.
Thank you, Jan.